In the heart of the bustling city, where people rushed past one another with coffee cups in hand and headphones in their ears, sat an old man on the cold steps of a busy subway entrance. His name was Rahim, though no one asked. Dressed in layers of tattered clothing and a weathered wool cap, he sat quietly each morning, an empty tin cup at his feet and a faded cardboard sign that simply read, "Still breathing, still hoping." To most, he was invisible, just another beggar lost in the noise of urban life. Few knew that Rahim had once been a respected schoolteacher, a man who had dedicated decades to shaping young minds and inspiring students to dream big. But tragedy had come like a storm in his life, ripping everything away. A car crash had taken his wife and only son, and grief had swallowed him whole. Unable to cope, he lost his will to teach, to live, and eventually, his job and his home. Now, the pavement was his pillow and the sky his ceiling. But despite the harshness of his new reality, Rahim never allowed bitterness to grow in his heart. Each day, he offered smiles to strangers and whispered blessings to those who dropped spare change in his cup. People may not have seen his worth, but Rahim held on to it quietly, like a sacred ember still burning in the ashes. He watched the world from his spot on the steps, watched ambition, indifference, kindness, and cruelty all walk by in human form. He had nothing, yet in his eyes there was still depth, still wisdom, still light. Often, he would close his eyes and remember his classroom, the faces of his students, the joy of teaching poetry and history, and the gentle voice of his wife reading beside him at night. Those memories became his treasure, his strength. And though his hands trembled from the cold and hunger gnawed at his belly, Rahim still believed, somehow, that life wasn't finished with him yet. He didn't know how or when, but a tiny flicker of hope lived inside him, refusing to die. And sometimes that was enough to face another day. One particularly chilly morning, as Rahim sat wrapped in a threadbare blanket, the usual stream of commuters rushed past without pause, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. He had learned not to expect much, maybe a coin, a nod, or nothing at all. But that day someone stopped. A young man in a neatly pressed suit stood in front of Rahim, his brows furrowed with something that looked like curiosity, or perhaps compassion. Unlike others, he didn't glance at the tin cup or toss a coin and leave. Instead, he crouched down to Rahim's level and spoke. "Excuse me, sir," he said gently. "Do you mind if I sit with you for a moment?" Startled, Rahim nodded slowly. The young man introduced himself as Asher, a marketing intern working in the nearby office building. He said he'd seen Rahim many times, but never had the courage to stop, until today. What followed was a conversation that would spark something neither of them expected. Asher asked about Rahim's life, his story, and his eyes widened in disbelief when Rahim revealed he had once been a teacher. "You have the voice of someone who still teaches," Asher said. "There's something in your words." Rahim smiled softly, humbled but amused. Over the next few days, Asher returned, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with food, and always with time. They talked about books, about life, about pain and healing. Rahim shared his philosophies, thoughts on kindness, forgiveness, and survival. Asher, inspired by these conversations, began jotting down notes, scribbling quotes on napkins, recording bits of wisdom on his phone. He was amazed by how someone who had lost so much could still offer so much insight and peace. Then, one day, Asher told him, "I started a blog. I'm calling it Lessons from the Steps." "It's your words, Rahim. People need to hear them." Rahim chuckled, a dry laugh laced with disbelief. "Who wants to hear from an old beggar?" But Asher only smiled. "You're not just a beggar. You're a survivor, a philosopher, a teacher." In that moment, something stirred inside Rahim, a flicker of worth he hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, his voice still mattered. And perhaps his story, once buried in silence, was finally beginning to be heard. Weeks passed, and the bond between Rahim and Asher grew stronger, stitched together by heartfelt conversations and shared silences. Asher continued updating his blog, Lessons from the Steps, with Rahim's thoughts on life, resilience, and human dignity. To their surprise, the blog began gaining traction. Comments poured in. Strangers from across the country thanked Rahim for his wisdom, for reminding them of the beauty in small things and the strength of the human spirit. The blog became a quiet revolution, spreading compassion in a world that often looked away. Rahim, still sitting on the same subway steps, now had people stopping, not to drop coins, but to shake his hand, to listen, to learn. Some brought sandwiches, others simply offered a smile. For the first time in years, Rahim felt seen. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was connecting. One evening, Asher arrived with news that changed everything. A non-profit organization dedicated to helping the homeless had read the blog and wanted to meet Rahim. "They're offering you a place to stay," Asher said. "A warm bed, meals, even counseling if you want it." Rahim's eyes welled up. He hesitated, not because he didn't want it, but because after years of being forgotten, he wasn't sure if he could trust kindness anymore. But Asher placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've given so much to the world already. Let it give something back." Slowly, Rahim agreed. Moving into the shelter was surreal. He had a room of his own, a real pillow, a warm shower, and food that didn't come from the generosity of strangers. It was overwhelming, yet healing. He began volunteering at the center, helping others who had walked a similar road. Word of his story continued to spread, and soon, Rahim was invited to speak at schools and community events. Standing in front of young faces, he rediscovered the teacher within, the man who could shape minds and inspire hope. He spoke of loss, of darkness, and the light he found not in wealth, but in human connection. The city that once passed him by now leaned in to listen. The man once lost in the shadows was now casting light. Rahim, the beggar on the steps, was becoming something more, a voice the world needed to hear. A year after that first conversation on the subway steps, Rahim stood behind the curtain of a grand auditorium, dressed in a clean, pressed suit, a simple one, but to him it felt like royal robes. The lights beyond the stage were bright, and the hall buzzed with anticipation. He was the keynote speaker at a TEDx event, invited not because of fame or fortune, but because his story had become a symbol of human resilience. Asher stood beside him, now a published author and motivational speaker in his own right, tears brimming in his eyes. "You're not just changing lives," Asher whispered. "You're reminding people they're never truly lost." When Rahim stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. He took a deep breath, his voice steady, full of quiet power. He spoke not with grand gestures or dramatic flair, but with the raw truth of a man who had fallen and found the strength to rise again. He began, "Then I was nothing. Or so I thought. I lost everything, my family, my career, my home. I became invisible. But one kind stranger reminded me that my story wasn't over." His words struck hearts like arrows of truth. He didn't preach success, he preached survival, faith, and the unbreakable strength of the human soul. "Even when life strips you down to nothing," he said, "you still have a choice: to rise, to speak, to hope." The standing ovation that followed was thunderous. People came up to him afterward, not with pity but with admiration. They called him a mentor, a guide, a symbol of light in dark times. Rahim's days of sleeping on concrete were long gone, but he never forgot them. He continued working with shelters, mentoring youth, and speaking wherever people needed to hear that they mattered. The same steps where he once sat forgotten were now a landmark. People left flowers, notes, and coins not for charity, but in tribute. Rahim had not only rebuilt his life, he had ignited thousands. No longer a nameless figure on a street corner, he was a storyteller, a survivor, and above all, a reminder that no soul is ever too broken to begin again. His journey from beggar to beacon proved that hope, once sparked, can light even the darkest paths.